Whenever we read passages of Scripture that were originally directed specifically to ancient Israel, we need to be very careful in transferring it to the modern period, as if our great nation, the United States, were some kind of new Israel. Ancient Israel was called into being for a very specific purpose, but we can learn a great deal from them. And so this morning, I would like to read for you a portion of one of Moses' teachings to the people of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, beginning at the 11th verse. Take care, lest you forget the Lord your God, by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wildernesses, with its fiery serpents and scorpions, and the thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and my might and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. And if you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods, and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. Well, I am quite certain that many of you, if not all of you, are very concerned about America's future. And as a student of American history, I like to ask, what wisdom do those who went before us have for us to help as we move forward? Not for the purpose of going backwards or being stuck in the past, but to take advantage of the wisdom and experience of those who've gone before us, so as not to repeat past mistakes or to have to relearn what has already been discovered, and to remain grounded in the principles that have stood the test of time. I would like to let the great leaders of the past speak for themselves. And so throughout this message, I will be sharing a number of quotes, and the references for those quotes will be in the printed version of the sermon when we get that prepared, if you want to check out on me as to where I got them. Now, oftentimes, when we hear people trying to account for the difficulties that our nation is currently facing, it is often blamed on television, too many guns, entertainment and the internet, drug culture, people not being taught history, fatherless families, threats to free speech, the diminishment of marriage, untrustworthy public officials, the right and left demonizing each other, and so much, much more. But all of these, I submit to you that all of these are of great concern, but that they are symptoms of a deeper problem, of a greater problem. And what I very rarely, if ever, hear discussed is the decline of moral values, the basic consensus of how we are going to live together that drives everything else. I submit that what is happening is that we have lost, or we are in the process of losing, our moral compass. Now, some of you might say, well, you know, we really shouldn't be discussing matters of national interest in the church. And I agree with you that we should not be discussing politics However, politics on the one side and biblical theology of state are two entirely different things. And you might quote to me Jesus' famous statement, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's." And so that might suggest two entirely different realms. But do you recognize a rhetorical question embedded in what Jesus said? Because ask yourself this question: what possibly on earth belongs to Caesar that doesn't already belong to God? Everything belongs to God. In Psalm 24, it says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell in it therein." Everything and everybody already belongs to God. So what could possibly belong to Caesar that doesn't already belong to him? And this teaches us that the separation of church and state doesn't necessarily mean the separation of God from state. As theologian Abraham Kuyper once said, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" Take care, lest you forget the Lord your God. Charles Colson once told of a remarkable encounter that he had with a small-town newspaper editor. Chuck was in town to speak at the local civic club, and prior to going in, and the editor of the local newspaper stopped him and said, "I just want you to know, Mr. Colson, that I'm the one who was very instrumental, or most instrumental, in getting the 10 Commandments taken down from our public buildings and from our schools." And Chuck says, "Well, why would you want to do that?" And so he gave the usual answer of separation of church and state and how we don't want to overly influence the children in religion because that would do them harm. Okay, so Chuck goes in and gives his speech. And afterwards, during the Q&A session, this same editor raised his hand and said, "Mr. Colson, you do a lot of work in the prisons and work with a lot of inmates. In the last several years here in our little town, we've had a rash of burglaries, especially from our young people. Do you have any suggestions about what we could do about this?" And so Colson says, "Well, you know, you could start by when they're from the point of when they're very, very young on up, is to regularly reinforce them, good value reinforcement. So for instance, you might want to start putting up on the walls things like, 'Do not steal.'" And the guy says, "You know, you may have something there." Now, in the first chapter of the letter to the Romans by Paul that we have read this past month, Paul describes the deterioration of a culture, how that downward spiral happens. And his point is that when you put the human being above God, and the way he puts it is if you worship the created instead of the creator, that's what leads you to all kinds of crazy roads that you don't want to go down. And that's what accounts for a downward spiral of a culture. And that is, in fact, the fallacy of that period in history that we call the Enlightenment. Now, there was a lot of good things that came out of the Enlightenment. But the fallacy of the Enlightenment is the belief became that the measure of all things is human reason. In other words, we don't need revelation from God, but that rather the human mind is sufficient for all things. And we want to ask the question, why in the world would you make the limitations of fallen man, the reasoning power of fallen man, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and ends of all things? That's why God said that he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and of all things. At the height of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln declared to the Congress that the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. Now, this is as applicable today as it was then. And while I agree entirely with Mr. Lincoln that there are times when we need to think anew and act anew in order to face contemporary challenges, I still submit that you can do that without sacrificing the fundamental principles upon which the nation was founded. Now, what are these? Well, today we'll consider two. And these are essential to understanding America's experience in self-government. And I would say experiment in self-government. It was an experiment because nobody had done it before. And if we forget them as a nation, we will do so at our own peril. Well, the first principle for today is that our founders believed that our rights come from God, not from the government. And that is why the Continental Congress declared in our Declaration of Independence, and you're well familiar with this, we hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning you don't have to prove them, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is to say that our rights come from God, not from any king or from any government entity. But the question for us in our modern age is, if we remove God from the public arena, from where do our rights come? Does it come from the legislature? Does it come from the president? Do they come from the courts? Because if so, they can take away our rights just as easily as they presume to give them, which is exactly what our founders were rebelling against. They charged that the king and the parliament were overstepping their bounds and abusing their power, and that certain rights are unalienable, meaning they cannot be taken away because they come from God, and no human agency is in a position to take them away. Now, one of the highest threats to American liberty that is the result of removing God from our moral conscience is what is called statism. Now, what is statism? Well, theologian R.C. Sproul describes it this way. In statism, we see the suffix isms, which indicates a philosophy or worldview. A decline from statehood to statism happens when the government is perceived as our claims to be the ultimate reality. This reality then replaces God as the supreme entity upon which human existence depends. Now, he quotes Hitler's Third Reich and the Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's Communist China as extreme examples of this. But there's variations all along the way. And of course, those three that he quotes are atheistic, man-worshiping governments that somehow decided that it was acceptable to commit genocide because it suited their interests. Now, this is precisely the extreme that the founders were trying to avoid. Now, before we go any farther, let me make sure that we all understand and agree that government is not inherently a bad thing. Some people like to say, the government's a necessary evil. No, the government can become evil, it can become corrupt, but it is not a necessary evil because, as a matter of fact, governance was part of creation. Think about it for a moment. Go back to the Garden of Eden. God created the human being, put him in the garden to do what? To manage the garden. He put him in charge. Their governance is part of the creation. And so otherwise you have anarchy. Okay, but when the government becomes an end in itself, given human depravity, tyranny is the inevitable result. When we see this more and more when we view the government as the answer to all of our problems, when we look to the government to provide for all of our needs, when we depend on it to control life so as to create a supposed perfect society, when government assumes the role and responsibility of the people by guaranteeing outcomes. Well, such government as this denies human nature. It thwarts our personal aspirations. It destroys incentive, and by necessity must be coercive. Notice that our Constitution begins how? We the what? the people, not we, the Congress, not we, the government. That was intentional. Now, this principle was so crucial to the founders is that it actually served as a justification for the revolution itself. The Bible teaches in Romans 13 that we must obey civil authorities. And our founders agreed entirely with that, totally. But they also declared that God is sovereign even over kings. And in fact, later on in that same declaration, they said that they were appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. In other words, the justice of our intentions. That we have a right to rebel because the founders, they themselves did not see themselves as traitors. Because even government answers to God. But the question is, if we remove God from the equation, then our founders were nothing more than a mutinous mob. Just think about that for a moment. And if we remove God from the public arena, our rights can never be unalienable. And if we are going to remain free, including the free exercise of religion, speech, and assembly itself, we must never forget him. The second principle is that self-government necessitates a moral population. That is to say, if we are going to have a free and open society, if we're going to function as a republic, we must be able to trust each other that to a large degree we're going to behave ourselves. John Adams, our second president, had this to say about that. Listen carefully. We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whole, or as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Now, the reason for this is what the founders understood is a very basic principle, that the extent to which people have fewer internal restraints is the extent to which that we must be subject to external restraints, thus limiting our freedom in order to keep order. The less self-disciplined we are, the more need there is for the authority to control and maintain order. Think about children. When children are real little, parenting is all about control. That child does not have the discernment to know how not to break things or hurt themselves. And so the parent has to inflict on or impose on that child complete control. But as the child gradually grows, a wise parent is able to discern when the proper time is to give that child responsibility, because you know they can trust because they have the internal restraints to behave. Well, the same is true with a population at large. And moving closer and closer to giving up our freedoms for some temporary security is always a dangerous idea. In fact, Ben Franklin even made the case, the saying that those who would give up their freedom for some temporary security deserve neither freedom nor security. Wrap your brain around that thought for a moment. Now, there's no easy answer to this, except that the founders saw the necessity to provide a moral consensus with which the people could live, in which they could live freely. Because fallen people will act like fallen people, which is what we're seeing all over the place. But that same Ben Franklin, who was not known for a consistent churchgoer, was highly supportive of people being involved in churches and communities of faith because he believed it made for better citizens. Now, before we go any further, we must never fall into the trap to think that there was a time of a golden age when in America we got all things right. And there are certainly various segments of our citizenry that would have much to say about this. Because these were certainly times in our history when we were not following the ways of the master. But at the same time, we must resist the temptation of thinking that freedom without restraint is true liberty. Freedom exists within boundaries, and ideally God's boundaries. Because think on this, without God, all things are permissible, and anarchy is the result. Because without God, how would we declare that anything being right or wrong? Pilate asked the very question during Jesus' trial. He said, "What is truth?" Good question. Human beings have been wrestling with this ever since he asked that question. And he said that with the truth standing right in front of him. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So we know from that there is such a thing as truth. It's discernible, and Jesus is it. But Pilate asked the question, what is truth? And without him, what right do we have to say anything is right or anything is wrong? It's the age-old barroom question. Who says? Hey, you can't do that. Who says? How do we stand up to evil without a standard by which to appeal? I submit to you today that what we need is not to enact more laws. We've got plenty of laws. And more importantly, we have God's laws. What we need is more internal restraints. What we need is a revolution of the American soul. What we need is a return to God. What we need is spiritual revival. And this, my friends, is the mission of the church. Why do you think Jesus gave us the Great Commission? And he said, go into the world and make disciples. Now, why disciples? He didn't say don't go in the world and make converts to sign up for your church rolls. He said make disciples. Why? Because a disciple of Jesus is one who lives his life in the image of the master. He gave us the way he wanted us to live, how he wanted us to relate to one another, and all the things in which that his sacrificial love was based upon. He said, go and make disciples. Make people who will follow me and live as disciples. And if we do that, the extent that we do that, we will transform American life. That's why that was the last orders, if you will, a commandment that Jesus gave us. Go into the world and make disciples. Put my mark on them. Baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teach them everything that I taught you. Now, this is what Moses was trying to do with the Israelites, trying to get them to understand as they're prepared to enter into the land God was giving them. Take care, he said, lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you this day. And the father of our country, George Washington, said no less. Now listen carefully. He said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of duties of men and citizens. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in the exclusion of religious principle. Now let that sink in for a moment. Now, I am concerned that we Americans do not realize the harm we are doing to this country and to our liberty by maintaining the foolish insistence on removing the voice of the faith community from the mainstream of public discourse. Not that we're going to force a particular religion on anybody. It's the last thing the founders wanted. but it's not necessary. It has its own appeal. But the faith community must first prove itself worthy of that presence in the public arena by faithfully living out how the Master taught us to live. That is to say, the world needs to see in us what we're talking about. It's the same thing that Moses was trying to get across to the Israelites. God brought this group of people into being to be a witness to the world. And that's why all through the Old Testament, Israel keeps being chastised and over again, because if you guys don't follow God's commandments, how do you expect the rest of the world to do that? And so it's vitally important to maintain our credibility. If we are going to have a voice in the public square, we have to walk the talk, so to speak. We have to show them how Christianity, not just Christianity as a religious organization, but a discipleship to Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. That it is a better way to live. And at the same time, if our nation insists on silencing the voice of the faith community, we deny our own heritage. Despite what our revisionist historians may say, this country was founded with principles of the Judean Christian tradition and ethic as its basis. Now, we're not trying to say that the founders tried to create a Christian nation per se, a theocracy, but it was their worldview. The Judeo-Christian tradition was their worldview, and so naturally, the nation that they founded was going to be based on that worldview. Once again, not to force anybody else to become a Christian, but those are the principles on which they founded this republic. Our second president, our sixth president, the son of our second president, John Quincy Adams, said this: "The highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government and those of Christianity." And then much later, Franklin Roosevelt said this: "The United States is the lasting concord between man and nations, founded on the principles of Christianity." Now, friends, I'm going to let the great Washington once again have the floor one last time. Now, listen carefully. "I now make it my earnest prayer," and for those who want to suggest that George Washington was not a praying man, would have a problem with this quote. "I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have you and the state over which you preside in his holy protection. That he would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion. And without a humble imitation of whose example in these things, we can never hope to be a happy nation." Take care, lest you forget the Lord your God. And may we never become a nation without God, but always be one nation under God. Amen.
Shelter rising.